Victory in Jesus. I thought a lot of Ruby as we were singing that song, and being with her that night in the hospital when she'd experienced a stroke and having a lot of physical issues, and praying with her and being with her, and her family was there, quite a bit of the family, and friends, a couple of friends. And it was interesting to witness the peace that she had. And that's just the way it works, isn't it? Victory translates into peace.
Amen.
And Ruby had peace. Ruby had victory. She wasn't fighting. She was smiling, she was peaceful, and she was restful. We will meet on Saturday to celebrate Ruby's life, and we invite you to come this Saturday at 2 p.m. So please come and pay your respects and honor her and her family, and be prepared to share some memories. You are her family. So we want to honor her and her family with the memories that Ruby has blessed us with. This morning we will share communion together, and over the last few weeks God has really been speaking to me about this whole process of coming to the table. And those of you that read the daily devotionals that were printed out, typed out for the Advent season, you'll know that there was one that talked specifically about when Jesus met Levi, the tax collector. And he said, "Come and follow me." And Levi, who we know now as Matthew, left everything, left his practices, his dishonesty, his squandering money from people. He left everything and he turned and followed Jesus. And he invited Jesus to his home, to his table, to a meal, and he invited a bunch of friends. And Jesus went and met and ate at Levi's table. This morning I want to look into this whole concept a little bit. I have spent hours in the last few weeks reading stories in the Bible about meeting at the table, about groups of people, some positive and some not so positive, and we'll get into a few of those this morning. But I want to first direct your attention to this verse, two verses in Luke chapter 15. This chapter is known as the one that Luke records three parables that Jesus gives, three stories: the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. And it just blew me away, because I guess I just skipped over these two verses and always gone right to those stories. But because of my renewed awareness of this topic, it was drawn to my attention. In Luke 15, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. This made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he, Jesus, was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them." How cool is that? Jesus was willing to go to their table. He was willing to be seen with them. You see, in the Bible, a person is identified by the table that he sits at, by the people that sit at the table with him. You are identified by the groups of people that you allow yourself to eat your meals with. There was a day in our country when the meal table, the dinner table, held a much higher place in our culture and our social standings than it does today. 50, 80, 100 years ago, people were always at the dinner table together. They worked hard together in the farm, in the fields, raising and growing and gathering all that they needed to bring to the table. And then they would come together to the table for their meal. They were identified by their family. So it's interesting to read through the Bible and to see situations where people have come together at the table. One of the stories that really fascinated me is in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, and it has to do with Joseph. And I know this story very well, but this little piece, again, is something I had skipped over before, not realizing the significance of it. You'll remember that Joseph had this dream and knew that somehow God was going to put him in a place of leadership over his brothers, and his brothers were very resentful of him. Already they knew that their father Jacob seemed to like, for whatever reason, Joseph better. He gave him special gifts, the coat of many colors, and all these kinds of things. He seemed to get special preferential treatment, and the brothers resented it to the point that they tried to kill him. And when that failed, they saw that a caravan of people, Egyptians coming through, were heading back to Egypt. And so they took their own brother, Joseph, and they sold him as a slave. They said, "We don't want him, you take him. You'll give us money? Even better." And it's interesting because the family, and I've thought a lot in the years past about the family and the church as a family, and oftentimes we are hurt more by our own brothers and sisters within the family than we could ever imagine to be hurt by someone outside. Joseph was taken away. He was sold to this man Potiphar, and Joseph served well. He was honorable. He honored his master, and most of you probably know the story that his wife tried to make advances towards him, and Joseph refused. "I don't want any part of that. I don't want to dishonor my God. I don't want to dishonor me and my family, anybody. I don't want any part of that." And she made the false accusations that he had attempted to, seduce her. And because of that, he ended up in prison. And it was there that he was able to tell the story, to interpret a dream that a fellow prisoner had, and it helped him to be released. And he said, "Just remember, when you get out there, remember who helped you with this, right? Don't forget me." And sure enough, it was 2 years went by before the Pharaoh had a dream, actually 2 dreams. And then the butcher said, "Well, wait a minute, there's that guy. What's that guy? In prison, he told us our dreams. Maybe he can interpret the dream you had, Pharaoh, because nobody else could." And so they went and got him, and he interpreted the dream to mean 7 years of plenty, of lots of produce, lots of fruit and vegetables, and then 7 years of famine. And he advised Pharaoh, "This is a warning from God, and you need to be prepared. During these years of plenty, stock up, store up, be prepared for the 7 years of famine." And Pharaoh took his word. In fact, he was so moved by Joseph's ability to interpret the dream and the counsel that he gave him, and he said, "I will make you the manager over all of the wealth of our country, of all of Egypt, and you'll organize this, you'll plan it, you'll have people bring it to the storehouses, and you'll be the one to manage. They'll have to come to you to get their food that they need during the time of famine." The famine was not restricted only to the land of Egypt. It spread beyond, and even to the homeland of Joseph, to his father and his brothers and all of their families. Eventually, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt to buy food. all the brothers except one, Benjamin, the youngest. And they had to go before Joseph. They had no idea who he was, but they had to go before him and said, "We've come to buy food. We live in another land, and we've come here. We know you have plenty, and we've come to pay you for your food and to buy food so that we can live." The arrangements were made, and each man was given food and grain and stuff to load on their donkeys, and then the money that they had, each one was placed in their bags as before they left. And it wasn't until they were well on their way that they realized that they had the money. And fear began to set in because they thought, well, what happened? They're going to think that we stole this money back, and we can never go back there because they're going to kill us. They'll know that we tricked them somehow and got the food and kept our money. They continued home, they went, they ate, they survived for a while. In fact, one of the brothers had to stay back in Egypt. That's another part of the story. You'll have to read it all. It's a great story. But eventually, the food ran out. And again, they needed to go. But they didn't want to go because they were going to have to take Benjamin, the youngest son, at the request of Joseph. But they ended up talking to Jacob, and all the brothers went back to Egypt. Fearful, going, facing this ruler of Egypt. And as they came before him, he invited them into the palace for a meal. And the brothers were like, "What are we going to do? They're going to execute us. They know what we did." And they brought the money back, and so they talked to one of his handlers, and they said, "Hey, we've just got to tell you, I don't know what happened, but when we came last time, when we bought the food, when we left, we realized somehow that money ended up in our bags, and we in no way meant any harm to your master. Please take the money." And the guy said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Come and sit at the table." This is the part of the story I wanted to get to, and I had to give some of the background, but Joseph invited these men, which he knew were his brothers, but they had no clue. He invited them into the palace, into Pharaoh's palace. And we'll pick up just a little bit of the story in Genesis 43, verses 32 through 34. It says, the waiters served Joseph at his own table, and his brothers were served at a separate table. The Egyptians who ate with Joseph sat at their own table because Egyptians despise Hebrews and refused to eat with them. So you get the picture. Joseph had his table with his honored servants and trusted loyal guards and everything, but his brothers sat at another table because they weren't allowed to eat together. And Joseph told each of the brothers where to sit. And he placed them in their spots according to age, the oldest first and all the way around the table. And the brothers were amazed. Well, how could he possibly know this? Joseph filled their plates with food from his own table, and giving Benjamin, the youngest son, 5 times as much as he gave the others. So they feasted and drank freely with him, the scripture said. They were invited to the palace. They were invited to Joseph's table. The rest of the guys didn't want anything to do with them. They were Hebrews, not Egyptian. It was later that Joseph would reveal his identity as the brother that they had sold into slavery. It's an amazing story. He became the second most powerful man in Egypt. Joseph invited these men to the table in the palace, Pharaoh's palace, because they were his people. Even if they weren't Egyptians, and the Egyptians didn't understand it, they were his people. He identified with them. This offer was not given to everyone who came looking for food, but these men came and sat at Joseph's table. This was a display of grace. Joseph treated his brothers, his guests, better than they deserved or expected to be treated. Joseph, after revealing who he was, invited them to go and get the rest of the family and come and live in the land of Goshen, the rich, fertile land in Egypt. And so they did. They brought their families, and that's how it all initiated with the Hebrew people, the people of God living in Egypt and eventually becoming slaves after this Pharaoh and Joseph and all his brothers died. Eventually there would be a deliverer, somebody who would come and deliver them out of this slavery. Moses would come. God would use him to challenge the Pharaoh, the wicked Pharaoh that now sat on the throne. And as they escaped the slavery and as God led them through the wilderness and through the Red Sea, God made provision for them. On the night that they were to be delivered, they were given instructions. They said, each family go on this certain night, go and take a goat or a sheep that's 1 year old with no deformities. And you're to slay that animal. You're to take the blood and you're to mark your doorposts with that blood, identifying yourselves as God's people, as people who trust in God. And then you're to sit down and have a feast, a meal. And they were given the instructions on what they were to do, and they were to eat all of the meat, consume it completely. If it was more meat than what they could eat as a family, they were to share with another family. And whatever was left had to be burned so that nothing would be left. It was a meal that identified them as God's people, who would be delivered by the hand of God, and who would that day rise up and follow him wherever he led them. Exodus 12:14 says, "This is a day to remember. Each year from generation to generation you must celebrate it as a feast or a festival to the Lord." There was great significance in the meal, in the assembling together as a family, coming together and identifying themselves as the people of God. As they were wandering through the wilderness, headed towards the promised land, turning here and there and everywhere, and God gave them instructions on how to build a tabernacle, a portable place of worship, made of tents and walls that would be put up around, that could be taken down and moved whenever they moved. And it's interesting that after all the instructions on how to build the tent structure, God gave them further instructions of specifically what to put in the different places of the tabernacle. In the Holy of Holies, back behind the big drape, they were supposed to put the Ark of the Covenant, a special box, table box made for the stones that God gave to Moses when he was up on Mount Sinai. And in the other place, the next place from there, the holy place, this is what I wanted to get to. God instructed them to make a table out of acacia wood. People ask us about the street we live on. We live on Acacia Court. It's a wood. It's a type of tree. But to make this table 3 feet long, 18 inches wide, and 27 inches tall, make it of acacia wood and overlay it, cover it with gold, which is symbolic of the earthly, the common, the human, and the divine. It speaks of the coming together of that which is human and that which is divine, eternal. And on that table, they were to have incense, and also, significantly, they were to have 12 loaves of bread. A loaf that represented each of the tribes of Israel, which was each of the sons of Jacob, which were all in the story with Joseph and Benjamin and the rest of them. These loaves of bread every week were to be eaten by the priests, and 12 new loaves laid out there. I don't know, 7-day-old bread, I'm not sure. I do know somebody who likes to buy day-old donuts and eat on them all week, but week-old, dry, stale bread, I'm not sure how that works. But they were instructed to eat the bread at the end of each week and replace it with 12 fresh loaves. They were to come to the table. They were to come as an act of worship and eat the bread that symbolizes the provisions of God and the power of God and the family of God, the people, the tribes who became the people of God, the people of Israel. It reminded them that they were accepted by God and that they were part of God's family. Maybe you're connecting some dots today. Jesus, on the night that he was arrested, met with the 12 men that were his family. The men that he poured his life into. The men that walked the roads with him. The men that witnessed incredible power and working of God. The men that sensed and knew the presence of God as it was displayed in Jesus himself. They came to the table in the upper room. The men that Jesus taught and instructed and helped them to clear their mind of the things that they had been, trained and to understand in this world, and to realize that there's a whole different set of values and purposes when you follow God. The followers of Jesus were identified as the family of God. And that night, Jesus served them the cup and the bread. They ate together. They shared the meal, the loaf, and the cup. Today, we will share the meal. We will come to the table as the family of God, as those who've witnessed his presence and his power in our lives, as those who have come to the table to be identified as the people of God. We will come to the table. Another interesting story in the New Testament, in the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul, who gives his list of credentials. He's a Jew if there ever was one. He followed all the rules, went to the best schools, trained by the best guys. Nobody could find fault with him in keeping the law, in doing the things that the Jewish people were expected to do. But then one day, he met Jesus, and Jesus showed him and taught him. It's all different. It's all about Jesus. It's not all about the law and about the things that everybody has been doing for so many years. When Jesus died on the cross and gave his body, he opened the table to more than one group of people. He opened the table to all who would come. And so in the book of Galatians, Paul Paul communicates how his ministry has been to go to all the different places outside of the land of Israel to share the gospel with the Gentiles. That there was the calling that God put on his heart. And so in the midst of all of that, there became this conflict that arose. So let's look at Galatians chapter 2, beginning with verse 7. Paul is explaining this in the letter, and he's talking about the leaders back in Jerusalem, the Jewish Christians. He said, they saw that God had given me the responsibility of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as he had given Peter the responsibility of preaching to the Jews. For the same God who worked through Peter as the apostle to the Jews also worked through me, Paul, as the apostle to the Gentiles. In fact, he says, James, Peter, and John, who were known as pillars of the church, recognized the gift that God had given me. And they accepted Barnabas and me as their co-workers. They encouraged us to keep preaching to the Gentiles while they continued their work with the Jews. Their only suggestion was that we keep on helping the poor, which I've always been eager to do. But this is the point of contention, the point of conflict. When Peter came to Antioch, I had to oppose him face to face, for what he did was very wrong. When he first arrived, he ate with the Gentile Christians at the same table, who were not circumcised. But afterwards, when some friends of James, the apostle in Jerusalem, when some friends of James came, Peter wouldn't eat with the Gentiles anymore. He was afraid of criticism from these people who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. As a result, other Jewish Christians followed Peter's hypocrisy, and even Barnabas, Paul's partner in ministry, even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. When I saw that they were not following the truth of the gospel message, I said to Peter in front of all the others, since you, a Jew by birth, have discarded the Jewish laws and are living like a Gentile, why are you now trying to make these Gentiles follow the Jewish traditions? You and I are Jews by birth, not sinners like these Gentiles. That's the name that was given to them, anyone who is non-Jewish. Yet we know that a person is made right with God by faith in Jesus Christ, not by obeying the law. And we have believed in Christ Jesus so that we might be made right with God because of our faith in Christ, not because we have obeyed the law. For no one will ever be made right with God by obeying the law. This was a huge conflict within the church in the first century, trying to figure all this out. How does this work? The Jewish people, the way that they had lived to honor God for so many centuries already, and now with this new covenant, this new work that Christ has come to do. What are the new traditions? What are the new ways? What are the new expectations? Paul challenged Peter about choosing not to eat with the Gentile Christians whenever Jewish Christians were around. It's interesting. It's one thing in theory to think, oh yeah, we should reach anyone we can, right? As Christians, as the body of believers, as the church, the family of God. We should reach anyone we can. But often when theory comes down to practice, there's maybe a little resistance or resentment in thinking, oh, well, they're really not part of us. They're really not permitted to come to the table. It was dangerous, and Paul pointed it out. It became the central theme and focus of this letter to the Christians in Galatia, to the Gentile Christians. And today we must be ever so careful that we don't fall into the same trap, putting expectations on people that Christ himself did not put on them, putting up barriers, putting up rules and restrictions that would keep somebody from coming to the table. I came across this picture. It's titled The Last Supper, appropriately. It's a work of art at a monastery, St. Emma Monastery in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. The artist Timothy Schmaltz said that the 12 empty seats around Christ at the table represent the fact that you and I are now to come to the table as the disciples, as the apostles, the sent ones. That Jesus is waiting for not only each of us, but many others to come to the table. The bread and the cup are waiting. The sacrifice has been made. The table has a place for you. The table, again, represents the power and the presence of God. It represents a person's identity as one who has become a member of the family of God. It's an active, ongoing invitation to all to come to the table. It's an inclusion to all people, all races, all walks of life, to come to the table. So this morning, we come to the table. May we come with an appetite to know God, experience Him, not only remember in the past, but anew experience the power of Christ and His grace in our life. Come with an appetite and a deep longing to know God. Come to the table with a love for God and a love for all who come with you. Come to the table thinking of, whom can I invite to the table next time? Who is it that God wants me to invite to the table? Who am I to include at the table?